She had 6 minutes to save the boy's life, and she didn't even know his name. Emma Morales knelt beside the small Apache child who writhed in the dust outside Copper Mesa's trading post, his dark skin already showing the telltale flush of scorpion venom coursing through his tiny body. The boy's eyes rolled back, showing only white, while his small fists clenched and unclenched as poison attacked his nervous system. Emma's medical training from back east kicked in like a slap of cold water every second now, precious as silver. She had treated scorpion stings before, but never on a child this young, never with venom this potent, and never when the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride through Apache territory that had claimed more lives than smallpox this summer. The morning had started like any other in the Arizona Territory's most isolated settlement, where the year 1882 felt more like 1852, given how far they were from anything resembling civilization. Emma had been checking her medical supplies in the back room of Martinez trading post, taking inventory of the dwindling bottles of laudanum and carbolic acid that served as the only barrier between Copper Mesa's residents and the countless ways the desert could kill a person. She was the settlement's only source of medical care, a responsibility that had fallen to her not because she sought it, but because she was the only person within 100 miles who had attended nursing school before her father's debts, and her mother's death had driven her west to this godforsaken patch of sand and stone. The screaming had started around 10 in the morning, high-pitched and desperate in a way that made Emma's blood freeze in her veins. She had heard children cry before, had heard them scream when they broke bones or suffered burns, but this sound was different, primal, the kind of sound that spoke of life slipping away like water through cupped hands. Emma dropped her inventory sheet and ran toward the front of the trading post, her heavy skirts catching on wooden crates and her medical bag bouncing against her hip with each hurried step. Outside, she found a scene that would be burned into her memory forever after. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 years old, dressed in traditional Apache clothing with intricate beadwork that spoke of loving hands and careful craftsmanship. His black hair was braided with leather strips and turquoise beads adorned his small moccasins, but now he lay convulsing in the dirt while a massive Apache warrior stood over him, speaking rapid words in a language Emma didn't understand. The warrior's face was a mask of controlled terror, the kind of expression she had seen on fathers' faces when their children balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. The scorpion that had caused this horror lay crushed nearby, its yellow-brown carapace gleaming in the harsh desert sun. Emma recognized it immediately as an Arizona bark scorpion, the most venomous species in North America, and capable of killing a grown man within hours. On a child this small, the timeline would be much shorter. She had perhaps 6 minutes before. The venom reached the boy's heart and stopped it forever. Without thinking, Emma rushed to the child's side and began her assessment with hands that trembled despite her training. The boy's pulse was racing like a hummingbird's wings, his breathing shallow and labored, his skin hot to the touch and covered in a sheen of sweat that spoke of his body's desperate fight against the toxin. His pupils were dilated to pinpricks, and when Emma gently lifted his eyelids, she could see the telltale muscle spasms that indicated the venom was attacking his nervous system with ruthless efficiency. The Apache warrior above her spoke sharply in his native tongue, and Emma looked up to meet eyes that were dark as obsidian and filled with a father's desperate rage. He was tall and powerfully built, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent under the desert sun and the scars that marked him as a veteran of countless battles. His clothing was traditional Apache buckskin, decorated with intricate patterns, and a medicine bag hung from his belt alongside a knife that looked capable of skinning a buffalo. This was clearly a man of importance among his people, and the child dying in the dust was obviously precious to him. "I'm a nurse," Emma said in English, hoping he might understand some of the words, even if her accent was unfamiliar. "I can help him, but I need to work quickly." She gestured to her medical bag and then to the boy, trying to communicate her intent through actions rather than words. The warrior's expression didn't change, but he stepped back slightly, giving her room to work while keeping his hand near his knife. Emma understood the unspoken message clearly. If she failed to save this child, she might not live to see another sunset. Emma's training took over as she opened her medical bag and retrieved the supplies she would need for the most critical medical intervention of her life. She had treated scorpion stings before, but always on adults with stronger constitutions and better chances of survival. Children were different. Their small bodies less able to process the venom, their organ systems more vulnerable to the cascade of toxins now flooding the boy's bloodstream. She had perhaps 4 minutes left before irreversible damage occurred. The first step was to slow the spread of venom through the boy's system, and Emma quickly pulled a leather strap from her bag to create a tourniquet above the sting site on his small arm. She tightened it just enough to restrict blood flow without cutting off circulation entirely, a delicate balance that could mean the difference between saving his life and causing permanent damage to his limb. The boy's convulsions were getting stronger now, his small body arching off the ground as the venom attacked his nervous system with increasing violence. Next came the most dangerous part of the treatment, one that could either save the child's life or kill him outright if Emma miscalculated the dosage. She retrieved a small vial of liquid laudanum from her bag, the opiate-based medication that could counteract some effects of the scorpion venom by depressing the boy's overactive nervous system. But the dosage had to be precise. Too little would be ineffective. Too much would stop his breathing altogether. Emma had no scales to measure the medication, no textbook to consult, only her experience and intuition to guide her hands as she prepared what might be the boy's last hope. The Apache warrior watched every movement with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey, and Emma could feel his eyes boring into her as she worked. She understood that in his mind, she held his child's life in her hands, and that responsibility weighed heavier than the desert heat pressing down on them. Other Apache warriors had appeared as if from nowhere, forming a silent circle around. The scene, their faces grim, and their hands resting on weapons that could end Emma's life in an instant if she failed in her task. Emma administered the laudanum by forcing it between the boy's clenched teeth, holding his head steady while the medication trickled down his throat. Almost immediately, his convulsions began to lessen slightly, though his pulse remained dangerously rapid and his breathing stayed shallow and labored. She knew the laudanum was only buying them time, not providing a cure, and that the next few minutes would determine whether her intervention had been enough to save his life. While waiting to see if the laudanum would take effect, Emma began treating the sting site itself with carbolic acid to prevent secondary infection and reduce local inflammation. The boy's arm was already swelling around the puncture wound, the skin turning an angry red color that spoke of the body's inflammatory response to the venom. She cleaned the area as thoroughly as possible under the circumstances, working with steady hands despite the knowledge that Apache warriors surrounded her and watched her every move. The minutes crawled by like hours as Emma monitored the boy's vital signs and waited to see if her treatment would prove effective. His pulse began to slow slightly, dropping from the dangerous rapid flutter to something more sustainable, though still faster than normal. His breathing deepened incrementally, and the violent convulsions that had racked his small body began to subside into occasional muscle spasms. These were positive signs, but Emma knew they were far from out of danger. As the immediate crisis began to stabilize, Emma became acutely aware of her surroundings and the precarious nature of her situation. She was a lone white woman surrounded by Apache warriors in territory where her people and theirs had been at war for decades. The recent conflicts had left both sides suspicious and hostile, with trust being a commodity rarer than water in the desert. Yet here she was, literally holding an Apache child's life in her hands, while his father and kinsmen watched her every move with expressions that could shift from gratitude to violence in a heartbeat. The boy's father, the tall warrior she would later learn was called Faye, knelt beside his son and spoke softly in Apache, his words carrying the gentle cadence of a lullaby despite the gravity of the situation. Emma didn't understand the language, but she recognized the universal sound of a parent comforting their child, the same tone she had heard in sick rooms from New York to California. Love, she realized, sounded the same in any language, and the fierce tenderness in Faye's voice as he spoke to his unconscious son transcended cultural barriers. Emma continued her vigil beside the boy, monitoring his pulse and breathing, while keeping watch for any signs that the venom might be gaining ground despite her intervention. The scorpion's toxin was still in his system, still capable of causing organ failure or cardiac arrest if his small body couldn't process it effectively. She estimated they would need at least 2 hours before she could be reasonably certain he would survive. 2 hours during which she would be completely dependent on the goodwill of warriors who had every reason to distrust her. The trading post around them had fallen silent, with the usual bustle of commerce suspended as word spread about the drama unfolding in the dusty street. Emma caught glimpses of faces peering from windows and doorways, mostly Mexican and white settlers who looked just as uncertain about the situation as she felt. The presence of so many Apache warriors in the settlement was unusual and potentially dangerous, as tensions between the groups had been running high since the latest round of conflicts had claimed lives on both sides. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Emma noticed that the boy's color was beginning to improve slightly, the grayish pallor that had frightened her giving way to something closer to his natural complexion. His pulse continued to slow toward normal ranges, and his breathing became less labored with each passing minute. These were all positive signs, but Emma knew that scorpion envenomation could be unpredictable, with patients sometimes appearing to recover before taking sudden turns for the worse. The child stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering as consciousness began to return in fits and starts. Emma leaned closer, speaking softly in English, even though she knew he wouldn't understand her words. Sometimes the tone of voice mattered more than the actual language, and she hoped her calm, reassuring manner might penetrate through his confusion and fear. His small hand moved weakly, and Emma gently took it in hers, feeling the fragile bones beneath skin that was still too warm but no longer burning with fever. Faye watched this interaction with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail, every gesture, every expression that crossed Emma's face. She could feel his scrutiny like a physical weight, but there was something else in his gaze now, something that might have been the beginning of respect or even gratitude. The fierce, protective instincts of a father were slowly giving way to recognition that this white woman had risked her own safety to save his child's life. Other Apache warriors in the circle began speaking among themselves in low voices. Words too quiet for Emma to hear, even if she had understood their language. She caught occasional glances in her direction and sensed that they were discussing her actions, possibly debating what her intervention meant for their relationships with the white settlers of Copper Mesa. The political implications of what had just occurred were complex and potentially far-reaching. The boy's eyes opened fully for the first time since the crisis began, focusing with difficulty on Emma's face hovering above him. He tried to speak, but could only manage a weak whisper in Apache that his father answered with evident relief. Faye's stern expression softened as he realized his son was truly going to survive, and for a moment the fierce warrior became simply a grateful father whose child had been pulled back from the edge of death. Emma knew that the immediate danger had passed, but she also understood that the boy would need continued monitoring for the next several hours to ensure no complications developed. Scorpion venom could cause delayed reactions, and children were particularly susceptible to secondary effects that might not manifest until later. She would need to stay close to her patient, which meant remaining in the presence of Apache warriors, who might decide at any moment that her usefulness had ended. As if reading her thoughts, Kie stood and spoke directly to Emma for the first time, his words careful and deliberate, despite the obvious language barrier. "You," he said in heavily accented English, pointing at her and then at his son, "save Taza." The name meant something in Apache that Emma didn't understand, but she recognized it as the boy's identity, the first piece of personal information she had learned about the child whose life she had just saved. Emma nodded and managed a small smile, despite the tension that still crackled in the air around them. "Taza," she repeated, looking down at the boy, who was now watching her with curious dark eyes. "His name is Taza." She pointed to herself and said, "Emma," hoping to establish some basic communication that might help bridge the cultural chasm between them. The immediate crisis was over, but Emma sensed that the real consequences of this day were only beginning to unfold. She had saved the life of an Apache child in front of his father and kinsmen, an action that would ripple through both communities in ways she couldn't yet imagine. 3 days had passed since Emma saved Taza's life, and now she was beginning to question whether it had ever happened at all. The morning after the Scorpion incident, Emma had awakened before dawn, with her heart still racing from dreams of convulsing children and obsidian-eyed warriors watching her every move. She had dressed quickly and hurried to the trading post, expecting to find some trace of the previous day's drama, some evidence that she hadn't imagined the most intense medical emergency of her career. Instead, she found only Martinez sweeping dust from his front porch, as if nothing extraordinary had ever occurred in that exact spot. "Buenos dias, señorita Emma," Martinez had called cheerfully, his weathered face showing no sign that he remembered Apache warriors surrounding his establishment while a child fought for his life. "You're up early today? More medical supplies to inventory?" His casual tone had struck Emma as odd, almost deliberately so, as if he were working hard to maintain an atmosphere of normalcy. Emma had searched the ground where Taza had lain, writhing in agony, looking for any physical evidence of the encounter. The dust showed countless footprints from the settlement's daily traffic, but no specific traces of the Apache party that had materialized and vanished like desert mirages. Even the crushed Scorpion that had caused the crisis was nowhere to be found, swept away by wind or perhaps deliberately removed by someone who preferred that no reminders remain. "Martinez," Emma had said carefully, "yesterday, when the Apache boy was stung by the Scorpion, did you see what happened after I treated him?" She studied his face for any flicker of recognition, any sign that he shared her memories of that terrifying and miraculous morning. The old trader's expression had grown guarded, his eyes shifting away from hers in a way that suggested discomfort rather than confusion. "Señorita, I was in the back room most of yesterday morning, taking inventory of the flour shipment. I heard some commotion outside, but by the time I came to investigate, everything was quiet again." His words carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned that in frontier territory, survival often depended on seeing and hearing as little as possible. Emma had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert's pre-dawn coolness creeping up her spine. Either Martinez was lying to protect himself and his business, or something far stranger was happening in Copper Mesa. She had spent the rest of that first day questioning other residents about the incident, only to encounter the same pattern of selective amnesia or carefully constructed ignorance. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the settlement's only boarding house and usually knew every piece of gossip within 50 miles, claimed she had been doing laundry behind her establishment and had heard nothing unusual. Sheriff Dalton, whose office window faced directly toward the trading post, insisted he had been out on patrol and had no knowledge of any Apache presence in the settlement. Even young Tommy Rodriguez, who spent most of his time playing in the street and noticed everything, suddenly developed a case of convenient forgetfulness when Emma asked about the previous day's events. The conspiracy of silence was so complete and coordinated that Emma began to doubt her own memory and sanity. Had she really knelt in the dust beside a dying Apache child while his father watched her with eyes that could have belonged to a hunting wolf? Had she actually administered laudanum to a convulsing 7-year-old boy while surrounded by warriors who could have killed her without a second thought? The memories were vivid and detailed, but the complete absence of corroborating evidence made them feel increasingly dreamlike. Emma's medical training had taught her about hallucinations brought on by stress, isolation, and the constant pressure of being the only source of medical care in a hostile environment. She had been working long hours, treating everything from gunshot wounds to dysentery, surviving on little sleep and less companionship, carrying the weight of life and death decisions that would have challenged physicians with decades more experience. Perhaps her mind had simply conjured an elaborate fantasy to cope with the crushing responsibility. By the second day, Emma had retreated to her small cabin behind the trading post, spending hours reviewing her medical journals and trying to find some rational explanation for her vivid memories of treating scorpion envenomation. She found detailed notes about previous cases she had handled, careful documentation of symptoms and treatments, but nothing about Apache children or obsidian-eyed warriors. The absence of any written record was particularly troubling, as Emma had developed an almost compulsive habit of documenting every medical case she encountered. The isolation began to weigh on her more heavily than ever before, and Emma found herself questioning not just her memories, but her entire reason for remaining in this God-forsaken settlement. She had come west to escape the suffocating expectations of Eastern society and the painful memories of her mother's death. But now she wondered if she had simply traded one form of prison for another. At least in Boston, she had been surrounded by people who acknowledged her existence, even if they disapproved of her unconventional choices. Emma's third night of restless sleep was interrupted by sounds that made her heart race with recognition and terror. Soft footsteps moved around her cabin, accompanied by the faint jingle of metal ornaments and the whisper of leather against stone. She lay frozen in her narrow bed, listening to sounds that matched perfectly with her memories of Apache warriors moving through the settlement 3 days earlier. The footsteps circled her cabin twice before stopping directly outside her front door, and Emma held her breath as she heard what sounded like something being placed carefully on her wooden doorstep. The sounds were so soft that she almost convinced herself she had imagined them, but her racing heartbeat and cold sweat testified to her body's absolute certainty that someone or something was just beyond the thin barrier of her door. Emma waited until the pre-dawn light began filtering through her single window before she found the courage to investigate the sounds that had kept her awake for hours. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, and she found herself praying to a god she wasn't sure she still believed in, that she would find nothing on her doorstep, that her overwrought nerves had finally conjured auditory hallucinations to match her supposed visual ones. Instead, she discovered a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin and tied with sinew, placed with obvious care in the exact center of her doorstep. The bundle was no larger than her two hands pressed together, but it felt heavy with significance as she lifted it and carried it inside her cabin. Her fingers shook as she untied the sinew binding, uncertain whether she was about to find proof of her sanity or evidence of something far more complex and dangerous. Inside the deerskin wrapping, Emma found 3 items that sent her heart racing with recognition and wonder. The first was a small piece of turquoise, carved into the shape of a scorpion and polished until it gleamed like captured sky. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of skilled hands and representing hours of patient labor. The symbolism was obvious and unmistakable. This was directly connected to the scorpion that had nearly killed young Tarzar. The second item was a bundle of dried herbs that Emma didn't immediately recognize, though their pungent aroma suggested medicinal properties. The plants had been carefully harvested and prepared, bound together with hair that might have been from a horse's mane or tail. Emma's limited knowledge of Apache culture suggested that medicine bundles like this one carried spiritual significance beyond their practical applications. The third and most significant item was a small piece of cloth that Emma recognized immediately as a fragment torn from her own apron, the same apron she had worn while treating Tarzar 3 days earlier. The fabric showed traces of dust and what might have been dried blood, physical evidence that supported her memories of kneeling in the street while fighting to save a child's life. This single piece of cloth validated everything she remembered about that terrifying and miraculous morning. Emma sank into her single wooden chair, clutching the deerskin bundle and its contents, while tears of relief and confusion streamed down her face. She wasn't losing her mind. The Apache boy was real, his father was real, and the medical emergency that had consumed her thoughts for 3 days had actually occurred. But if that was true, why had everyone in Copper Mesa conspired to convince her otherwise? What could possibly motivate such elaborate and coordinated deception? The answer came to Emma with the sudden clarity of lightning illuminating a dark landscape, and it filled her with equal measures of understanding and dread. The residents of Copper Mesa hadn't forgotten about the Apache incident. They were deliberately pretending it had never happened, because acknowledging it would force them to confront uncomfortable truths about their relationships with the indigenous people whose land they had claimed. Admitting that Apache warriors could move freely through their settlement, could appear and disappear at will, would undermine the illusion of safety and control that allowed them to sleep at night. Furthermore, Emma realized that her successful treatment of Tarzar had created a dangerous precedent that the settlement's leaders preferred to ignore. If word spread that Apache families could bring their sick children to Copper Mesa for medical treatment, it might lead to increased contact between the two groups, potentially complicating the careful balance of mutual avoidance that had allowed both communities to coexist in relative peace. Her act of compassion, however well-intentioned, had inadvertently threatened the status quo. Emma spent the morning examining the items in the medicine bundle, trying to decode their meaning and significance. The turquoise scorpion was clearly a reference to the incident that had brought their worlds together. But was it meant as gratitude, warning, or something else entirely? The dried herbs suggested that Tarzar's people had their own medical knowledge, and were perhaps offering to share it with her. The fragment of her apron might be intended as proof of the encounter, evidence that could validate her memories if she ever needed to convince others of what had occurred. As she contemplated the implications of the mysterious gift, Emma became aware of eyes watching her from beyond her cabin window. She looked up to see a figure standing motionless at the edge of the settlement, too distant to identify clearly but unmistakably human in silhouette. The figure remained perfectly still for several minutes, as if studying her cabin and its surroundings, before melting back into the landscape with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to this harsh environment in ways that Emma never would. The Watcher's presence filled Emma with a mixture of fear and anticipation that she couldn't fully understand or explain. Part of her wanted to run outside and call out to the distant figure to demand answers about the medicine bundle and the conspiracy of silence that surrounded Taza's rescue. But a deeper instinct warned her that patience might be more valuable than boldness in this situation, that the Apache people operated according to customs and timelines that didn't match her own cultural expectations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma decided to keep the medicine bundle secret, at least until she better understood its significance and the motivations of those who had left it for her. She carefully rewrapped the items in their deerskin covering and hid the bundle beneath her mattress, where it would be safe from casual discovery but accessible whenever she needed reassurance that her memories were real and accurate. The remainder of the day passed with Emma going through the motions of her normal routine while her mind churned with questions and possibilities. She inventoried medical supplies, treated a minor knife wound for one of the miners, and helped Mrs. Henderson's daughter with a persistent cough, all while feeling as if she were performing in a play where only she knew the real script. Every interaction carried undercurrents of deception and misdirection that made her feel increasingly isolated from her own community. That evening, Emma sat on her cabin's front steps and watched the sun set over the desert landscape, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that never failed to take her breath away, despite months of witnessing the same spectacular display. The beauty of the wilderness surrounding Copper Mesa was undeniable, but it came with dangers and complexities that she was only beginning to understand. She had saved one child's life, but in doing so, she had apparently set in motion forces that could change everything about her existence in this remote outpost. As darkness settled over the settlement, Emma found herself listening intently for any sounds that might indicate another nocturnal visit from her mysterious benefactors. The night remained quiet except for the usual desert sounds of coyotes calling in the distance and wind rustling through the sparse vegetation. But Emma felt certain that unseen eyes were watching her cabin from the surrounding darkness. The sensation was not entirely unpleasant, suggesting protection rather than threat, but it served as a constant reminder that her actions 3 days earlier had consequences she was still discovering. Emma finally retreated inside her cabin. As the temperature dropped with the sudden intensity that characterized desert nights, but she left her door unlocked for the first time since arriving in Copper Mesa. The gesture was small, but significant, a signal to anyone who might be watching that she was not afraid of contact with those who moved through the darkness beyond the settlement's borders. She had crossed a line 3 days ago when she chose to save Taza's life, and she was beginning to understand that there was no way back to the simple existence she had known before. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of turquoise scorpions and watching eyes, but Emma woke with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. Tomorrow would bring new developments in a situation that was growing more complex and intriguing with each passing day. The Apache war party arrived at dawn on the 7th day, and Emma knew immediately that her life would never be the same. Again, she had been grinding medicinal herbs from the mysterious bundle when the thundering of hoofbeats shattered the desert silence, a sound so primal and terrifying that it seemed to awaken something ancient in her blood. Through her cabin window, Emma watched as 20 Apache warriors on painted horses swept down from the mesa like a force of nature. their war paint gleaming in the early morning light, and their weapons catching the sun's first rays. At their head rode Faye, but this was not the desperate father she had encountered a week ago. This was a war chief in full regalia, magnificent and deadly as a hunting eagle. The settlement of Copper Mesa erupted into chaos as residents scrambled for cover, slamming shutters and barricading doors with the practiced efficiency of people who had lived with the constant threat of Indian raids. Emma heard Sheriff Dalton shouting orders to his deputies, the metallic clicks of rifles being cocked, and the terrified sobbing of children being hustled into root cellars and storm shelters. Within minutes, the bustling frontier town had transformed into a fortress under siege. But the Apache warriors made no move to attack, instead forming a perfect semicircle in the settlement's main street, with military precision that spoke of years of coordinated warfare. They sat motionless on their horses, a wall of bronze flesh and steel weapons that radiated controlled violence like heat from a forge. Emma could see their faces clearly now, painted with symbols she didn't understand, but which clearly held deep significance, each warrior a work of living art that celebrated both beauty and death. Faye rode forward alone, stopping directly in front of Emma's cabin with the confidence of a man who feared nothing this side of the grave. He wore traditional Apache war regalia that transformed him into something mythical. A leather breastplate decorated with turquoise and silver, eagle feathers woven into his long black hair, and paint that accentuated the sharp planes of his face until he looked carved from stone and shadow. His horse, a magnificent paint stallion, danced beneath him with barely contained energy. "Emma Morales," Faye called in English that was heavily accented but perfectly clear, his voice carrying across the settlement like the crack of thunder. "You will come with us now." It wasn't a request or an invitation, but a statement of fact delivered with the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Emma felt her knees go weak as she realized that her week of wondering and waiting was over. Emma stepped outside her cabin with hands that trembled despite her efforts to appear calm, acutely aware that dozens of rifles were probably trained on the Apache warriors from behind shuttered windows, and that she stood at the center of a situation that could explode into violence with the slightest provocation. The desert air felt electric with tension, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath in anticipation of bloodshed. "Why?" Emma managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying clearly in the unnatural silence that had settled over the settlement. "What do you want from me?" She knew that asking questions might be perceived as defiance, but her medical training had taught her that understanding a situation was the first step towards surviving it. Faye's expression remained impassive as he studied her with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance and demeanor. "You saved my son," he said finally, each word measured and deliberate. "Now the spirits demand you prove yourself worthy of the gift you have been given." His hand moved to rest on the handle of a knife at his belt, not in threat, but in emphasis of the gravity of his words. Emma's mind raced as she tried to understand what he meant by "the gift you have been given." But before she could form another question, Faye gestured sharply, and two of his warriors dismounted with fluid grace. They approached Emma with respectful but implacable determination, clearly intending to escort her, whether she agreed or not. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would be futile and potentially deadly. "Wait!" Emma called, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "If I come with you, what guarantee do I have that I'll return safely?" It was a bold question to ask of armed warriors who held her life in their hands, but Emma had learned from her medical practice that sometimes courage was the only currency that mattered in life or death situations. A ghost of what might have been a smile flickered across Kie's painted features before his expression returned to stoic impassivity. "The spirits will decide your fate," he replied, but something in his tone suggested that Emma's willingness to ask the question had been noted and perhaps appreciated. "If you are truly the woman who saved Taza, you have nothing to fear from. Apache justice." The phrase Apache justice sent a chill through Emma's blood, as she had heard enough stories about Apache treatment of captives to know that their concepts of justice might not align with her own cultural expectations. But she also understood that she had no real choice in the matter. Refusing to go would likely result in violence that would endanger not only herself, but the entire settlement of Copper Mesa. Her decision to save Taza had set forces in motion that could no longer be controlled or avoided. Emma quickly gathered her medical bag and the few possessions she couldn't bear to leave behind, including the mysterious medicine bundle that had started this entire chain of events. As she prepared to leave everything familiar and safe behind, she caught glimpses of her neighbors peering fearfully from behind curtains and shutters, their faces reflecting the same mixture of terror and fascination that she felt churning in her own stomach. One of the Apache warriors brought forward a horse for Emma, a sturdy mare with intelligent eyes and decorative tack that suggested she was being treated as an honored guest rather than a prisoner. Emma's limited riding experience made mounting the horse awkward, but the warrior steadied her with unexpected gentleness, his actions speaking of respect rather than contempt for her inexperience. As the war party prepared to depart, Sheriff Dalton emerged from behind his barricade with his rifle held in a manner that suggested readiness without immediate threat. "You can't just take one of our people," he called to Kie, though his voice carried more desperation than authority. "There'll be consequences when the cavalry hears about this." Kie turned his attention to the sheriff with the patient condescension of a predator addressing prey that had temporarily escaped its notice. "Your cavalry cannot catch the wind," he replied calmly, "and the woman comes willingly, as befits one who would walk the spirit path." With that cryptic statement, he wheeled his horse around and signaled for the party to move out. The ride into Apache territory was unlike anything Emma had ever experienced. A journey through landscape that seemed to exist outside normal time and space. The warriors moved with supernatural efficiency across terrain that would have challenged Emma's survival skills, following trails that were invisible to her untrained eyes, but which clearly served as highways for those who knew their secrets. The horses seemed to flow over rocks and through canyons like water finding its level. Emma found herself riding beside a younger warrior who introduced himself as Naiche, Kie's nephew, and apparently one of the few members of the party who spoke fluent English. His presence provided some comfort during the grueling ride, as he explained some of what was happening without revealing details that might compromise Apache security. "My uncle does not make decisions lightly," Naiche told Emma as they navigated a particularly treacherous canyon passage. "The medicine men have spoken with the spirits about what happened when you saved Taza. They say the spirits are pleased with your actions, but they must test your heart to see if your medicine is strong enough for what lies ahead." Emma tried to extract more information about what these tests might involve, but Nietzsche became evasive whenever she pressed for specifics. "Some things cannot be explained with words," he said with a slight smile that might have been apologetic. "You will understand when the time comes. For now, it is enough to know that you are under the protection of Kie's family, and no harm will come to you as long as you act with honor." The landscape through which they traveled was breathtakingly beautiful, but harshly unforgiving. A maze of red rock formations, deep canyons, and sparse vegetation that spoke of nature's power to both create and destroy. Emma began to understand why the Apache had been able to resist conquest for so long. This terrain would be almost impossible for conventional military forces to navigate effectively, while providing countless hiding places and defensive positions. For those who knew its secrets, as the sun reached its zenith, the war party stopped at a hidden spring that bubbled up from the desert floor like a miracle of life in the midst of desolation. The warriors watered their horses and refilled their water containers with ritualistic precision, and Emma realized she was witnessing practices that had been refined over countless generations of desert survival. Every movement was purposeful, every action calculated to maximize efficiency while minimizing risk. During the brief rest, Emma noticed that several of the warriors carried what appeared to be fresh injuries, wounds that had been treated with plant-based medicines but which clearly required more sophisticated medical attention. Her nursing instincts overcame her fear and uncertainty, and she approached Nietzsche with an offer to examine and treat the injured men. "You would use your medicine to help Apache warriors?" Nietzsche asked, his tone suggesting that her offer had surprised him. "Even though you are our captive and do not know what fate awaits you?" His question seemed to carry deeper implications than its surface meaning, as if her answer would be communicated to others and factored into decisions about her future. Emma looked around at the circle of painted warriors, men who could have killed her without a second thought, but who had treated her with unexpected courtesy throughout their journey. "Pain is pain," she said simply, "and healing is healing. If I can help reduce suffering, then I should do so regardless of politics or tribal affiliations." Her words carried the conviction of someone whose medical oath transcended cultural boundaries. What followed was Emma's first real interaction with Apache warriors as individuals rather than mythical figures from frontier legends, and she discovered that beneath the war paint and fearsome reputations were men with the same basic needs and vulnerabilities as any patients she had treated. One warrior had a deep gash on his forearm that was showing signs of infection, while another suffered from what appeared to be broken ribs that had been improperly set. As Emma worked to clean and re-bandage the infected wound using supplies from her medical kit combined with herbs that Nietzsche provided from his own medicine bundle, she became aware that her actions were being watched and evaluated by the entire war party. Every technique she employed, every decision she made about treatment seemed to be noted and filed away for later discussion. The warrior with the infected arm, whose name was Koshisa, endured Emma's treatment with stoic silence, but offered a slight nod of gratitude when she finished. "Your medicine is strong," he said in halting English, touching the fresh bandage with obvious relief. "The spirits were wise to bring you to us." His words seemed to carry official weight, as if he were delivering a formal judgment rather than casual praise. When Emma suggested that the warrior with broken ribs needed to have them properly reset to prevent permanent damage, Nietzsche translated her recommendation to Faye, who had been watching the impromptu medical session with intense interest. A brief conversation in Apache followed, too rapid for Emma to follow, even if she had understood the language. But she could sense that important decisions were being made. Faye approached Emma with the same measured deliberation he had shown during their first encounter in Copper Mesa, but now his expression seemed to hold something that might have been approval rather than mere assessment. "You offer healing to men who could be your enemies," he said in his careful English. "This shows wisdom beyond your years. The spirits whisper that you may indeed be the woman foretold in the old prophecies." Emma felt a chill of apprehension at the mention of prophecies, as her limited knowledge of Apache culture suggested that their spiritual beliefs could involve complex obligations and expectations that she might not be prepared to fulfill. "What prophecies?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer might commit her to a path she wasn't ready to walk. Kie's response was interrupted by the arrival of a lone rider approaching from the direction they had been traveling, a young Apache brave who rode his horse with the desperate urgency of someone carrying vital news. He spoke rapidly to Kie in their native language, his words tumbling over each other in a way that suggested extreme agitation or fear. The news, whatever it was, caused an immediate change in the war party's demeanor, as warriors who had been relaxed and casual suddenly became alert and focused with the predatory intensity of hunting wolves. Weapons were checked, horses were quickly watered and prepared for immediate departure, and the entire group transformed from a traveling party into a military unit ready for combat. Naicha translated the essence of the message for Emma's benefit, though his translation was clearly simplified and edited for her understanding. "Soldiers are coming," he said grimly. "A cavalry patrol is following our trail, trying to rescue you from what they assume is an Apache raiding party. We must move quickly if we are to reach the sacred canyon before they force us into a battle that none of us want." Emma realized that her disappearance from Copper Mesa had triggered exactly the kind of military response that could escalate into the bloody conflict that both communities had been trying to avoid. And she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Her choice to save one child had inadvertently put dozens of lives at risk. The sacred canyon held secrets that white men had died trying to discover. And now Emma stood at its entrance, knowing she might never leave. The war party had ridden hard for 6 hours through terrain that seemed designed by nature to swallow armies whole, following invisible paths through labyrinthine rock formations that provided perfect cover from the cavalry patrol that pursued them with grim determination. Emma's legs ached from hours in the saddle, her throat burned from desert dust, and her mind reeled from the impossible beauty of landscape that existed beyond the boundaries of any map she had ever seen. This was Apache heartland, sacred ground, that few outsiders had witnessed and lived to describe. The canyon itself defied rational description, a vast cathedral carved from red stone by millions of years of wind and water, its towering walls reaching toward heaven like the fingers of sleeping giants. Ancient pictographs covered the rock faces, telling stories in symbols that predated written language, while natural acoustics transformed every sound into something mystical and otherworldly. Emma felt the hair on her arms rise as she realized she was entering a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds had worn thin. At the canyon's heart lay an Apache village, unlike anything Emma had imagined during her years on the frontier. Not the temporary camps of popular imagination, but a sophisticated settlement that had clearly existed for generations. Adobe buildings, nestled against the canyon walls, their architecture blending seamlessly with natural rock formations until it was difficult to determine where human construction ended and geological formation began. Gardens flourished in carefully cultivated terraces, fed by springs that bubbled up from deep within the earth. As the war party entered the village, Emma became acutely aware that every resident had stopped their daily activities to watch. Her arrival with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, warriors touched their weapons with unconscious readiness, and elders observed her with eyes that seemed to weigh her soul against standards she couldn't begin to understand. She was clearly the first white person many of these people had ever seen up close. Kie dismounted and approached an ancient Apache woman whose bearing marked her as someone of tremendous importance within the community. Possibly a medicine woman or tribal elder whose word carried the weight of law and tradition. She stood barely 5 feet tall, but radiated authority that made Emma feel like a child being evaluated by a stern grandmother. Her weathered face told stories of decades spent navigating the complexities of survival in a hostile world. The Conversation between Kie and the old woman took place entirely in Apache, a rapid exchange of words and gestures that clearly concerned Emma's presence and purpose in the sacred canyon. Emma caught her own name mentioned several times, along with what she assumed was Taza's name, but the rest of the discussion remained incomprehensible to her untrained ears. The old woman's eyes never left Emma's face during the entire conversation, as if she were reading secrets written in expressions and posture. Finally, the old woman approached Emma with the measured gait of someone whose every step carried ceremonial significance. When she spoke, it was in English that was heavily accented but perfectly clear, suggesting years of interaction with white traders or prisoners that had given her comprehensive understanding of the language. "I am Ishtan, keeper of the old ways, and speaker for the spirits in this place. You are the woman who saved the son of Kie from the poisoned death." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact that seemed to carry implications Emma couldn't fully grasp. She nodded respectfully, unsure whether speaking would be appropriate or welcome in this obviously sacred context. The weight of dozens of watching eyes pressed down on her like a physical force, and she fought the urge to fidget or look away from Ishtan's penetrating gaze. "The spirits have spoken of your coming for many seasons," Ishtan continued, her words falling into the canyon's silence like stones dropped into still water. "They said a white woman with healing hands would arrive when the people faced their greatest trial, that she would be tested by fire and blood and spirit to determine if she was worthy of the great task ahead." The old woman's words sent chills through Emma's body as she realized that her random act of medical intervention had somehow fulfilled an ancient prophecy. Ishtan gestured for Emma to follow her deeper into the village, past buildings that housed families and workshops where craftsmen created items of both practical and spiritual significance. Emma saw weapons being forged, pottery being painted with intricate designs, and textiles being woven with patterns that seemed to capture the very essence of desert life. This was a thriving community with rich cultural traditions, not the primitive, nomadic existence portrayed in sensational newspaper accounts. They stopped before a building that was clearly different from the others, larger and more ornate, with symbols carved into its adobe walls that seemed to pulse with spiritual energy. "This is the house of testing," Ishtan explained as she gestured for Emma to enter. "Here, the spirits will examine your heart and mind to determine if you possess the strength and wisdom required for what lies ahead. Many have entered these walls seeking power or knowledge, but few have emerged unchanged." Inside the building, Emma found herself in a circular chamber lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls covered with pictographs depicting scenes of healing, warfare, and spiritual transformation. The air was thick with the smoke of burning herbs that made her head feel light and disconnected from her body. In the center of the room sat 3 Apache medicine men, their faces painted with symbols that made them appear more spirit than human. "Sit," commanded the eldest of the medicine men, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Emma lowered herself to the floor opposite the 3 men, her medical bag clutched in her hands like a talisman that might protect her from whatever was about to occur. The silence stretched between them until it became a living thing, pressing against her eardrums and making her acutely aware of her own heartbeat. The medicine man to her left began speaking in Apache, his words rhythmic and hypnotic, like an incantation designed to alter consciousness or summon supernatural forces. Emma couldn't understand the language, but she felt the power behind the words, washing over her like waves of heat from a forge. The herb smoke grew thicker, and she found her vision beginning to blur at the edges, while strange colors danced in her peripheral vision. "You will be tested 3 times, the eldest medicine man said suddenly, switching to English with startling abruptness. First, your skill as a healer will be examined by one whose life hangs by a thread thinner than spider silk. Second, your courage will be measured against dangers that would turn seasoned warriors into frightened children. Third, your heart will be weighed to determine if you can love those who are different from yourself. His words seemed to come from very far away, despite his physical proximity. Before Emma could ask questions or seek clarification, the chamber's entrance opened, and Nietzsche entered carrying a figure that made Emma's breath catch in her throat. It was Taza, the boy whose life she had saved in Copper Mesa, but now he appeared to be dying again from some new and terrible affliction. His small body was racked with fever, his breathing was shallow and labored, and his skin had taken on the grayish pallor that Emma recognized as a sign of imminent death. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The boy has been poisoned again, the eldest medicine man explained, as Nietzsche gently placed Taza on a blanket in the center of the chamber. But this time, it is not the venom of a desert creature, but something far more deadly, the poison of doubt and fear that attacks the spirit rather than the body. Our traditional medicines have no power against this affliction. Only the healing touch of one who has walked between worlds can save him now. Emma immediately moved to Taza's side, her medical training overriding her confusion about spiritual poisons and mystical afflictions. The boy's symptoms were real and severe, regardless of their supposed supernatural origins, and she had sworn an oath to preserve life wherever she encountered it. His pulse was rapid and thready, his temperature was dangerously high, and his breathing showed signs of respiratory distress that could prove fatal within hours. As Emma began her examination, she became aware that this was more than just a medical emergency. It was a test designed to evaluate her abilities under the most challenging possible circumstances. The medicine men watched her every move with the intensity of judges weighing evidence in a capital case, while the herb smoke and flickering lamplight created an atmosphere that was part hospital and part courtroom. Emma's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she assessed Taza's condition, checking his pulse points, examining his pupils for signs of neurological involvement, and listening to his breathing for clues about the underlying cause of his distress. Her medical bag yielded familiar tools and medications, but she found herself reaching also for the mysterious herb bundle that had been left at her cabin, as if some instinct told her that conventional medicine alone would not be sufficient. This combination of Western medical knowledge and Apache healing wisdom created a treatment approach that surprised even Emma herself, as she found herself grinding unknown herbs with practiced motions while simultaneously calculating dosages of laudanum and preparing poultices with ingredients she couldn't name, but somehow trusted completely. The medicine men nodded approvingly as they observed her seamless integration of different healing traditions. Working by lamplight in the smoky chamber, Emma spent 3 hours fighting to save Taza's life for the second time in 2 weeks, employing every technique in her considerable repertoire while learning new methods from the Apache healers, who guided her hands with gentle suggestions and encouraging murmurs. The boy's condition gradually stabilized as their combined efforts took effect. His breathing deepened, his fever broke, and color returned to his pale cheeks. When Taza's eyes finally opened and he smiled up at Emma with recognition and gratitude, the medicine men exchanged meaningful glances that suggested her performance had met their expectations. "The first test is completed," the eldest announced solemnly. "Your healing skills have been proven worthy of the Spirit's blessing, but greater challenges lie ahead, and failure in the next trial could mean death, not only for yourself, but for all those you have sworn to protect." Udin! Before Emma could fully process the implications of his words, the chamber's entrance burst open, and Kiye entered with urgency written across his painted features. He spoke rapidly in Apache to the medicine men, his words carrying news that caused immediate alarm among the assembled spiritual leaders. Emma didn't need translation to understand that something terrible was happening in the world beyond the sacred canyon. "The soldiers have found our trail," Nietzsche translated grimly as he entered behind his uncle. "A full cavalry company is approaching the canyon entrance with orders to recover you by any means necessary. Their commander has vowed to destroy the village if we do not surrender you immediately, and our scouts report that they carry fire weapons that could burn the entire canyon and everyone in it." The stakes of the situation had just escalated, beyond anything Emma had imagined possible. Ishton stepped forward with the calm dignity of someone who had faced countless crises during her long life. But Emma could see the deep concern in her ancient eyes as she contemplated the threat facing her people. "The second test comes sooner than expected," she said quietly. "You must choose between your own safety and the lives of those who have given you shelter. Will you surrender yourself to the soldiers to save Apache lives, or will you stand with us and face whatever consequences arise from that decision?" Emma looked around the chamber at the faces of people who had treated her with respect and hospitality, despite having every reason to distrust her. At Taza, who was alive because of her intervention at Kiye, who had risked everything to bring her to this sacred place, and at the medicine men who had welcomed her into their most sacred rituals. The choice seemed obvious, but she understood that the consequences would extend far beyond her personal fate. The sound of cavalry bugles echoing from the canyon entrance made the decision urgent and immediate, while gunshots in the distance suggested that the confrontation between Apache warriors and federal troops had already begun. Emma realized that her next words would determine not only her own future, but potentially the fate of every person in the hidden village. "I stand with the Apache," Emma declared, her voice carrying clearly despite the tremor of fear that threatened to undermine her resolve. "I will not abandon people who have shown me kindness and trust, regardless of what it costs me personally." Her declaration was met with nods of approval from the medicine men and a look of profound respect from Kiye that made her feel worthy of the faith they had placed in her. The eldest medicine man rose to his feet with ceremonial gravity and approached Emma with something wrapped in decorated deerskin, a bundle that radiated spiritual significance like heat from glowing coals. "Then you have passed the second test by choosing loyalty over safety," he intoned solemnly. "But the greatest trial still awaits, one that will determine not only your fate, but the future of both our peoples. What lies in this bundle will either save us all or destroy everything we hold sacred." Biki, Emma accepted the mysterious bundle with hands that trembled from exhaustion and stress, knowing that whatever it contained would change her life in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. As the sounds of battle grew closer, and the sacred canyon prepared for its greatest test in generations, the sacred bundle contained a marriage proposal that could either unite two warring peoples or destroy them both. Emma's hands trembled as she unwrapped the deerskin covering to reveal contents that made her heart stop and her breath catch in her throat like desert wind trapped in a canyon. Inside lay a traditional Apache marriage necklace crafted from silver, turquoise, and coral, with workmanship so exquisite that it could only have been created by master artisans over many months of patient labor. Beside it rested a smaller matching bracelet sized perfectly for a child's wrist, and beneath both pieces of jewelry lay a document written in careful English that would change the course of history in the Arizona Territory. The letter, written in Kie's distinctive handwriting, read like a treaty between nations rather than a simple marriage proposal, its formal language carefully chosen to address not only matters of the heart, but the complex political realities that governed relationships between Apache and white communities. Emma Morales, it began, you have proven yourself worthy of Apache respect through your healing gifts, your courage under fire, and your willingness to sacrifice personal safety for the welfare of others. The spirits have spoken, and the tribal council has voted. You are invited to become not only my wife, but a bridge between our peoples in the dark times that lie ahead. The marriage proposal continued with detailed explanations of what such a union would mean for both communities, outlining Emma's potential role as a cultural translator and diplomatic intermediary who could help prevent the kind of misunderstandings that led to bloodshed and tragedy. Kie wrote of his deep respect for her medical skills and his belief that their combined knowledge could create new healing traditions that would benefit both Apache and white patients. The document was simultaneously the most romantic and most politically sophisticated piece of writing Emma had ever encountered, but the marriage proposal was not the bundle's most shocking contents, as Emma discovered when she lifted the jewelry to reveal a second document that made her gasp with recognition and disbelief. It was an official commission from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, signed by territorial officials and bearing government seals that identified Emma as the first federally appointed liaison between the Apache Nation and white settlements in the region. The appointment carried significant authority and resources, including the power to negotiate treaties and establish medical facilities that would serve both communities. The implications of the federal commission were staggering, as Emma realized that her actions in saving Taza's life had triggered a complex chain of political maneuvering that extended all the way to Washington bureaucrats who saw an opportunity to resolve Apache conflicts through diplomatic rather than military means. Someone with significant influence had been watching her activities and had concluded that her unique position as a trusted outsider within Apache society made her invaluable as a bridge between two cultures that had been locked in deadly conflict. For decades, the sounds of battle raging at the canyon entrance grew louder and more desperate as Emma absorbed the shocking contents of the sacred bundle, gunfire echoing off stone walls, while war cries and cavalry bugle calls created a symphony of violence that threatened to drown out her ability to think clearly. The irony was almost unbearable. She held documents that could potentially end the Apache wars through peaceful negotiation. While outside the cave where she sat, those same wars continued to claim lives with ruthless efficiency. Kie entered the chamber as Emma finished reading both documents, his war paint smeared with sweat and dust from the fighting, a fresh wound on his left arm bleeding through hastily applied bandages. His eyes found hers immediately, searching, her expression for any hint of her reaction to his extraordinary proposal. The sounds of battle seemed to fade into background noise as the two of them stared at each other across the smoky chamber, both understanding that her answer would determine far more than their personal futures. The cavalry commander refuses to negotiate, Kie reported grimly to the assembled medicine men while his eyes remained fixed on Emma's face. Major Patterson claims he has orders to recover you by any means necessary and to punish the Apache for kidnapping a white woman. He will not listen to reason or accept explanations about your voluntary presence here. The fighting will continue until either we surrender you or defeat his forces completely. Emma rose to her feet with the marriage necklace still clutched in her hands, feeling the weight of silver and turquoise that seemed to contain the hopes and fears of two entire peoples. The jewelry was beautiful beyond description, but it also represented a choice that would cut her off forever from the life she had known and thrust her into a role she had never imagined. Becoming Kie's wife would mean accepting responsibility for bridging cultural divides that had been carved in blood over generations of mutual mistrust and violence. "The third test," whispered the eldest medicine man, his ancient voice barely audible above the distant sounds of gunfire and war cries. "Can you love those who are different from yourself deeply enough to sacrifice everything familiar and comfortable for their welfare? Can you open your heart to a man and a people whose ways are not your ways, whose gods are not your gods, whose future depends on your willingness to walk a path that no white woman has ever walked before?" Emma looked around the chamber at faces that had become dear to her during her brief time among the Apache people, at Taza, who watched her with the absolute trust that only children could offer, at Nietzsche, whose friendship had made her feel less alone in a strange world, at Ishtan, whose wisdom had guided her through spiritual trials she couldn't have imagined surviving. These people had welcomed her with generosity that contrasted sharply with the suspicious isolation she had experienced in Copper Mesa. But accepting Kie's proposal would mean more than just changing her personal circumstances. It would require her to become a symbol and a leader in ways that terrified her practical medical mind. The Federal Commission offered unprecedented opportunities to establish hospitals and training programs that could save countless lives, but it also carried the burden of representing government interests that might not always align with Apache welfare. Emma would be walking a tightrope stretched between two worlds that had every reason to mistrust her motivations. The chamber's entrance exploded inward as Apache warriors carried in wounded comrades whose injuries spoke of the intensity of the fighting taking place at the canyon's mouth. Bullets wounds and saber cuts that required immediate medical attention if the men were to survive the next few hours. Emma's medical training overrode all other considerations as she dropped the jewelry and reached for her medical bag, preparing to treat injuries that could prove fatal without skilled intervention. As Emma worked to stabilize the most seriously wounded warrior, applying pressure bandages to stem arterial bleeding while simultaneously preparing laudanum injections to manage shock and pain, she became aware that Kie was watching her with an expression that combined love and admiration with something deeper and more complex. He was seeing her not just as a potential wife, but as the healer his people desperately needed. Someone whose skills could mean the difference between life and death for Apache warriors and their families. "This is why the spirits brought you to us," Kie said quietly as Emma worked to save his wounded kinsman's life. "Not just to heal my son, but to become the bridge our peoples need to survive the changes that are coming. The old ways of warfare and raiding cannot continue too. Many have died on both sides, and more death will only lead to the extinction of the Apache nation. You offer a different path, one that leads to healing rather than destruction." Emma's hands never paused in their life-saving work as she absorbed Kie's words and their implications for her future, understanding that her medical skills had made her valuable to the Apache in ways that extended far beyond her ability to treat individual patients. She represented hope for a people who had seen their traditional way of life threatened by an expanding white civilization that seemed determined to eliminate or assimilate them completely. The wounded warrior's breathing stabilized as Emma's treatment took effect, and she moved on to the next patient while her mind wrestled with the monumental decision that awaited her response. Marriage to Kie would mean abandoning her plans to return to eastern cities, where women like her were beginning to find opportunities in established medical institutions. Instead, committing herself to a frontier existence that offered no guarantees of safety or success. Yet as Emma looked around at the wounded Apache warriors who trusted her with their lives, at Taza, whose continued existence depended on her willingness to bridge cultural divides, and at Faye, whose proposal represented not just personal love, but a vision of peaceful coexistence between hostile peoples, she realized that her heart had already made the choice. Her mind was still debating. Love was not just about romantic attraction, but about commitment to something larger than personal comfort and security. The battle sounds outside grew closer as cavalry forces apparently broke through the canyon's outer defenses, suggesting that time for decision-making was running out rapidly, and that within minutes the chamber might be overrun by soldiers whose orders included recovering Emma regardless of her personal preferences. The federal commission in her hands offered potential protection from military intervention, but only if she could find a way to communicate its existence to officers who were currently focused on combat rather than diplomacy. Emma made her choice with the same decisive courage that had driven her to dive into icy water to save Taza's life weeks earlier, understanding that some decisions required faith rather than careful analysis of potential outcomes. She lifted the marriage necklace and placed it around her neck, feeling the weight of silver and turquoise that represented not just jewelry, but a covenant between herself and an entire people who had placed their trust in her healing hands. "I accept," Emma declared in a voice that carried clearly through the smoky chamber, despite the chaos of battle raging outside. "I will marry Faye and serve as liaison between our peoples, using whatever skills and authority I possess to prevent further bloodshed and build bridges that can support lasting peace rather than temporary truces." Her words were met with smiles of relief and approval from the Apache leaders who had witnessed her transformation from reluctant captive to willing ally. Faye stepped forward with ceremonial solemnity and placed the child's bracelet on Taza's small wrist, symbolically adopting Emma into his family unit and creating bonds that transcended biological relationships. "You are now my wife, in the eyes of the spirits and the tribal council," he said formally, though his eyes held warmth that spoke of personal affection as well as political alliance. "Your healing gifts belong to all Apache people, and your wisdom will guide us through the difficult times ahead." The marriage ceremony, conducted according to ancient Apache traditions, adapted for wartime circumstances, took less than 5 minutes, but created legal and spiritual bonds that would endure for the rest of Emma's life, connecting her irrevocably to a people whose survival might depend on her ability to navigate the treacherous political waters that lay ahead. She was no longer just a frontier nurse, but a diplomat, a cultural ambassador, and a bridge between worlds that had been at war for generations. Before the brief ceremony could be completed, the chamber's entrance was darkened by the silhouettes of armed cavalry soldiers whose weapons were trained on the assembled Apache leaders with deadly intent. Major Patterson stepped forward with the arrogant confidence of a man accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. His uniform dusty from battle, but his authority intact despite the resistance he had encountered at the canyon's entrance. "Stand away from the woman," Patterson commanded harshly, gesturing for his soldiers to surround the Apache medicine men while keeping his own rifle pointed directly at Faye's chest. "Mrs. Morales, you are under federal protection and will be escorted back to civilization immediately. These savages will be punished for their illegal detention of an American citizen, and any resistance will be met with deadly force." His words carried the weight of military authority backed by superior firepower. Emma stepped forward, with the federal commission held prominently in her hand, her new marriage necklace gleaming in the lamplight as she prepared to use her unexpected political appointment to prevent a massacre that could destroy any possibility of future peace between Apache and white communities. The document represented power that even a cavalry major would be forced to respect, but using it effectively would require diplomatic skills she had never needed as a frontier nurse. "Major Patterson," Emma said with authority that surprised even herself, "I am no longer just Mrs. Morales, but the federally appointed liaison to the Apache Nation, with full diplomatic immunity and the power to negotiate treaties on behalf of the territorial government. I was not kidnapped, but invited here for official discussions about ending the Apache wars through peaceful means rather than continued bloodshed." Her words stopped the major's advance and created a moment of uncertainty that might provide an opening for negotiation rather than violence. 5 years after that first scorpion sting changed everything. Emma stood in the courtyard of the Morales Kie Medical Institute, watching her husband teach their 3-year-old daughter how to grind healing herbs, while Taza, now 12 and fluent in 4 languages, translated medical procedures for a delegation of Eastern doctors who had come to study their revolutionary integration of Apache and Western healing methods. The transformation had not been easy or immediate, and Emma often marveled at the complex series of negotiations, compromises, and occasional miracles that had turned a near massacre in a sacred canyon into the most successful peace treaty in the history of Apache-American relations. Major Patterson's initial fury at discovering Emma's federal appointment had given way to grudging respect when territorial officials confirmed her authority and ordered him to stand down from his planned assault on the canyon village. The weeks following Emma's dramatic revelation of her diplomatic status had been filled with tense negotiations, conducted in the same chamber where she had undergone her spiritual trials, with Emma serving as translator between Apache leaders who spoke no English and federal officials who understood nothing of indigenous customs or concerns. Her medical background proved invaluable during these discussions, as she could frame Apache needs in terms of public health initiatives that bureaucrats could understand and support. The treaty that emerged from those exhausting negotiations established the Colorado River Reservation as a sovereign Apache territory, with Emma's Medical Institute serving as both a healthcare facility and a diplomatic embassy where disputes could be resolved through discussion rather than violence. The agreement guaranteed Apache autonomy in exchange for their commitment to peaceful coexistence and their willingness to share traditional healing knowledge with white medical practitioners. Emma's marriage to Kie had initially sparked outrage among white settlers who viewed her choice as a betrayal of racial solidarity, but their anger gradually transformed into cautious approval as the benefits of the peace treaty became apparent in reduced military expenses and increased trade opportunities. The establishment of the Medical Institute brought unprecedented prosperity to the region, as people traveled from across the territory to receive treatment that combined the best of both medical traditions. The institute itself had grown from a single adobe building into a complex of interconnected structures that housed treatment facilities, research laboratories, teaching classrooms, and living quarters for the diverse staff of doctors, nurses, healers, and translators who worked together to serve patients from dozens of different cultural backgrounds. The architecture deliberately blended Apache and Mexican design elements with modern American construction techniques, creating spaces that felt welcoming to people from all traditions. Emma's daily routine now included responsibilities she never could have imagined during her lonely years as Copper Mesa's isolated frontier nurse, beginning each morning with rounds through wards where Apache children with respiratory infections received care alongside Mexican miners with crushing injuries and white settlers with chronic conditions that had previously been considered untreatable. The diversity of patients required constant adaptation of treatment protocols to account for cultural beliefs and practices that influenced healing outcomes. One of Emma's most innovative programs paired Apache healers with formally trained physicians, creating treatment teams that could address both physical symptoms and spiritual aspects of illness that Western medicine often ignored. The collaboration had produced remarkable results, including dramatic reductions in infection rates when traditional purification ceremonies were incorporated into surgical procedures, and significant improvements in chronic pain management when Apache herbal remedies were combined with conventional medications. Taza had become the Institute's unofficial ambassador, his natural charisma and multilingual abilities making him invaluable as a cultural interpreter who could help patients and staff navigate the complex intersection of different healing traditions. His near-death experience with scorpion venom had left him with an almost mystical understanding of the fragile boundary between life and death, wisdom that made him surprisingly effective at comforting people facing their own mortality. The young man's relationship with Emma had evolved from that of patient and healer to something resembling older brother and younger sister, with Taza serving as her cultural guide, while she provided him with access to educational opportunities that would have been impossible within traditional Apache society. His dream of becoming a physician himself had led to intensive tutoring sessions, where Emma taught him anatomy and physiology, while he shared traditional Apache knowledge about desert plants and their medicinal properties. Emma's own children, born of her union with Kie, were being raised bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable, participating in Apache ceremonies and attending classes taught by visiting professors from Eastern universities. Their daughter Maria possessed an intuitive understanding of plant medicine that astonished even experienced healers, while their infant son Samuel showed early signs of the same analytical mind that made Emma such an effective diagnostician. The success of the medical institute had attracted attention from government officials in Washington, who were looking for models that could be replicated in other regions, where conflicts between indigenous peoples and white settlers continued to claim lives and resources. Emma frequently traveled to the capital to brief territorial administrators and congressional committees about the practical benefits of treating Native Americans as partners rather than obstacles to be eliminated or assimilated. These political responsibilities often required Emma to navigate treacherous waters between competing interests that sometimes threatened the delicate balance she had worked so hard to establish. Federal bureaucrats who wanted to expand the reservation system, military leaders who preferred decisive action to diplomatic negotiation, and Apache factions who remained suspicious of any cooperation with white authorities. Her success depended on her ability to find common ground between groups that often seemed to have irreconcilable differences. One of Emma's most challenging diplomatic achievements had been convincing the Apache Tribal Council to allow traditional healing knowledge to be documented in written form, overcoming centuries of oral tradition that viewed such documentation as potentially dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. The compromise involved creating a secure archive where sensitive information could be preserved for future generations while remaining under Apache control. The Medical Institute's research division had made significant contributions to the understanding of desert medicine, documenting the properties of plants that had been used for healing purposes for countless generations, but which had never been systematically studied using Western scientific methods. Several of these discoveries had led to new treatments for conditions that had previously been considered incurable, bringing recognition and funding that helped ensure the Institute's long-term survival. Emma's personal relationship with Kie had deepened over the years as they learned to navigate the complexities of intercultural marriage while managing the enormous responsibilities of their public roles. Their love strengthened by shared commitment to healing and peacekeeping, then weakened by the inevitable cultural misunderstandings that arose from their different backgrounds. Their partnership had become a model for other couples attempting to bridge racial and cultural divides. The Institute's success had also created unexpected challenges, including attempts by unscrupulous businessmen to exploit traditional Apache knowledge for commercial purposes without providing compensation to the people who had developed and preserved that knowledge over generations. Emma's legal battles to protect indigenous intellectual property rights had established important precedents that benefited Native American communities throughout the territorial region. On this particular morning, as Emma walked through the Institute's gardens, where medicinal plants from around the world grew alongside native desert species, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from a lonely frontier cabin to her current position as one of the territory's most influential political and medical figures. The path had been far more complex and dangerous than anything she could have imagined when she first knelt beside a convulsing Apache child in the dust outside Martinez trading post. A commotion at the Institute's main entrance interrupted. Emma's morning meditation as a familiar figure approached, accompanied by an entourage of officials whose formal attire marked them as important visitors from territorial or federal government. She recognized Governor Murphy, whose support had been crucial in establishing the legal framework that allowed the Institute to operate with both Apache and American authority. Mrs. Kie, the governor called, using the hybrid name that Emma had adopted to reflect her dual cultural identity. I bring remarkable news from Washington that will affect not only your work here, but potentially the future of Indian relations throughout the American West. His excitement was evident despite his attempt to maintain official dignity appropriate to his high office. Emma gathered her family around her as the governor explained that President Arthur had signed legislation establishing a new federal program based directly on the success of the Merciless Medical Institute, authorizing the creation of similar facilities in other regions where conflicts between indigenous peoples and white settlers remained unresolved. Emma had been appointed as the program's national director, with authority to establish policy and allocate resources across multiple territories. The appointment represented both incredible recognition of Emma's achievements and an enormous expansion of her responsibilities that would require frequent travel and extended absences from the home and community she had worked so hard to build. Accepting the position would mean trusting others to maintain the delicate balance she had established while taking on challenges that could affect the lives of thousands of Native Americans and white settlers across the continent. As Emma considered the implications of the federal appointment, Taza approached with a suggestion that demonstrated the wisdom and maturity that had made him such an effective cultural ambassador despite his youth. You taught me that healing sometimes requires taking risks that seem impossible, he said quietly. Perhaps this is your chance to heal wounds that exist far beyond our desert canyon, to help other children avoid the kind of suffering that almost killed me. Emma looked around at the thriving community that had grown from a simple act of medical compassion, at patients from dozens of different backgrounds receiving care that would have been unavailable anywhere else in the territory, at her children who were growing up in a world where cultural diversity was celebrated rather than feared, and at her husband whose love had made possible transformations she never could have achieved alone. The decision, when it came, felt as natural and inevitable as her choice to dive into those churning waters years ago to save a drowning child, motivated by the same combination of professional duty and human compassion that had guided every major decision in her life. Emma accepted the federal appointment with the understanding that her work was far from complete and that the healing she had begun in one sacred canyon needed to spread across the entire American frontier. Years later, historians would mark Emma's appointment as the beginning of a new era in American Indian relations, one characterized by cooperation rather than conflict, by mutual respect rather than cultural supremacy, and by recognition that indigenous knowledge and Western science could complement rather than compete with each other. The success of her national program would save countless lives and prevent numerous wars, but its roots could be traced back to a single moment when a frontier nurse chose to risk everything to save an Apache child from a scorpion's venom. As Emma prepared for her new responsibilities, she often returned to the sacred canyon where her transformation had begun, standing in the same chamber where she had undergone spiritual trials that prepared her for challenges she couldn't have imagined. The turquoise scorpion that had been carved as a gift years earlier now rested on her desk as a reminder that healing sometimes requires confronting the very dangers that threaten to destroy what we love most. The little boy who had once lain convulsing in the dust now stood beside her as a young man whose bilingual abilities and cultural knowledge made him an invaluable partner in the work of building bridges between communities that had been separated by centuries of misunderstanding and mistrust. Id's survival had made possible not just his own bright future, but the healing of wounds that had seemed incurable when Emma first arrived in the Arizona Territory. Emma's story had become legend throughout the Southwest, inspiring other women to pursue medical careers and encouraging people from different backgrounds to seek common ground rather than focusing on their differences. The scorpion sting that had nearly claimed one child's life had ultimately saved thousands of others by creating new possibilities for cooperation and understanding between cultures that had seemed destined for perpetual conflict. On quiet evenings when her official duties were complete, Emma would sit with her family in their private courtyard and watch the desert sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded her why she had fallen in love with this harsh but beautiful land. The peace she had found here was deeper and more meaningful than anything she had experienced in her former life, built on a foundation of service to others and strengthened by love that transcended the artificial boundaries created by race and culture. The woman who had once lived in isolation, convinced that caring too much would only lead to disappointment and loss, had discovered that opening her heart to an Apache child and his father had opened possibilities she never could have imagined for healing not just individual patients, but entire communities torn apart by fear and misunderstanding, proving that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most remarkable rewards. 25 years after Emma first knelt beside a dying Apache child in the dust of Copper Mesa, Dr. Taza Morales Kie stood before the newly constructed statue of his adoptive mother in the center of what had once been a forgotten frontier settlement and was now the thriving city of New Harmony, Arizona. The bronze sculpture captured Emma perfectly as Taza remembered her from his childhood, kneeling beside a small figure with one hand extended in healing, while the other reached toward a towering Apache warrior, her face showing the same combination of determination and compassion that had driven every major decision of her remarkable life. The artist had somehow managed to convey in metal and stone the moment when three lives intersected to change the course of history in the American Southwest. Taza, now 37 and bearing the distinguished title of Chief Medical Officer for the Federal Bureau of Indigenous Health Services, had returned to dedicate the memorial on the anniversary of his mother's death, an event that had prompted an outpouring of grief and gratitude from communities across the continent where her healing programs had taken root and flourished. The crowd gathered for the ceremony included Apache elders, Mexican dignitaries, federal officials, and hundreds of ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by Emma's legacy. Among the assembled dignitaries stood Maria Morales Kie, now 28 and following in her mother's footsteps as both a physician and a diplomatic bridge between cultures, her dark hair adorned with traditional Apache ornaments, while her formal medical degree from Harvard University represented the synthesis of ancient wisdom and modern knowledge that Emma had pioneered. Beside her stood Samuel, 25, and serving as a federal judge whose rulings consistently protected indigenous rights while advancing the cause of intercultural cooperation. The ceremony began with traditional Apache prayers offered by Naiche, now an elderly but still vigorous leader, whose friendship with Emma had helped establish the foundations of lasting peace between his people and the expanding American nation. His words, spoken first in Apache and then translated into English and Spanish, honored Emma's memory while acknowledging the ongoing challenges facing communities still struggling to overcome centuries of mistrust and misunderstanding. Governor Richards, whose political career had been built largely on the success of Emma's innovative programs, spoke next about the economic and social benefits that had flowed from the decision to treat Apache knowledge as valuable intellectual and property rather than primitive superstition. The medical tourism industry alone had brought millions of dollars into the territorial economy, while the peaceful resolution of Indian conflicts had freed resources for education and infrastructure development. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from an unexpected source, Major Patterson, now retired but still ramrod straight at 73, who had traveled from his home in California to acknowledge publicly that his initial hostility toward Emma's diplomatic efforts had been wrong-headed and potentially catastrophic. His speech, delivered in the halting voice of a proud man admitting error, described how Emma's courage and vision had prevented what could have been the bloodiest Indian war in territorial history. "When I first encountered Mrs. Morales in that sacred canyon," Patterson said, his weathered face showing emotion he rarely displayed, "I saw only a white woman who had been deceived by savage propaganda, someone who needed to be rescued from her own misguided compassion. I could not comprehend that she was actually rescuing all of us from the cycle of violence and retribution that was destroying both communities. Her wisdom exceeded my understanding, and history has proven her right while revealing the limitations of my military thinking." The Major's words carried special weight because they came from a man whose entire career had been built on the premise that military force was the only language that Indians understood. His public acknowledgement of Emma's superior approach represented a fundamental shift in how American officials viewed the possibilities for peaceful coexistence between different cultures and peoples. As the formal ceremonies concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Taza found himself standing, alone before the statue, remembering the woman who had saved his life twice, first from scorpion venom, and later from the despair and hopelessness that had claimed so many of his generation who had watched their traditional way of life disappear beneath the advancing tide of American expansion. Emma had shown him that survival required adaptation rather than resistance, and that adaptation could preserve essential values while embracing beneficial changes. A small commotion near the memorial's base caught Taza's attention as he noticed a young woman kneeling beside the statue with what appeared to be a crying child, her actions so reminiscent of his own first encounter with Emma that he felt transported back through the decades to that terrifying morning when only as strangers. Compassion had stood between him and death. The parallel was so striking that Taza approached the pair to offer assistance. The woman looked up with tear-streaked cheeks as Taza knelt beside her, revealing features that marked her as probably Mexican or mixed heritage, while the child, in her arms, appeared to be suffering from some form of respiratory distress that required immediate medical attention. "Please help," she whispered in accented English. "My son cannot breathe properly, and I have no money for a doctor. I brought him here because people say this statue brings healing to sick children." Taza felt his heart constrict with recognition and wonder as he realized that Emma's legend had grown to encompass almost mythical healing powers attributed to her memorial statue, drawing desperate parents who saw her bronze likeness as a source of hope when conventional medicine seemed beyond their reach. The irony was both beautiful and heartbreaking. People were still coming to Emma for healing, even though she had been dead for 3 years. Without hesitation, Taza scooped the child into his arms and carried him toward the medical clinic that had been established adjacent to the memorial site, the same facility where Emma had trained dozens of physicians and healers who now served communities throughout the Southwest. As he walked, Taza explained to the frightened mother that treatment would be provided free of charge, funded by the Emma Morales Kie Foundation that ensured no child would ever be denied medical care due to poverty. The boy's condition, while serious, proved readily treatable with modern medications and techniques that had been unknown during Emma's early years as a frontier nurse. But Taza found himself thinking about how his adoptive mother would have handled the same case. With the limited resources available in the 1880s, her combination of medical knowledge, intuitive understanding, and unwavering determination to preserve life would have found a way to save this child even without the advantages of contemporary medicine. As Taza supervised the boy's treatment, he reflected on the complex legacy that Emma had left for those who continued her work. A network of medical facilities and diplomatic programs that had prevented countless tragedies while creating opportunities for cooperation that had seemed impossible when she first arrived. In the Arizona Territory, the peace she had helped negotiate had held for a quarter century, surviving political changes and economic pressures that had destroyed other treaties. The success of Emma's approach had inspired similar programs throughout the American West and had influenced government policy toward indigenous peoples in ways that continued to generate benefits decades after her death. Her fundamental insight that Native American knowledge and Western science could complement each other had revolutionized both medical practice and diplomatic relations between different cultural communities. But perhaps Emma's most important legacy lived in the people whose lives she had directly touched. Individuals like Taza, who carried forward her vision of healing and reconciliation into new generations and new challenges. The little Apache boy, who had almost died from scorpion venom, had grown into a man whose work continued to bridge cultural divides while advancing the cause of medical knowledge and social justice. As evening settled over New Harmony and the memorial ceremonies, crowds dispersed to their homes and hotels. Taza remained beside his mother's statue with his own children, sharing stories about the remarkable woman who had chosen to risk everything for the welfare of strangers and had thereby created possibilities for healing that extended far beyond individual medical cases. The bronze figure seemed to glow in the setting sun, as if Emma's spirit still radiated the warmth and compassion that had made her legend. The Mexican woman, whose son Taza had treated, approached shyly to express her gratitude, pressing a small, carved wooden scorpion into his hands with words of thanks that reminded him powerfully of the medicine bundle that had been left at Emma's cabin so many years earlier. The circular nature of the gesture was not lost on Taza, who understood that healing always involved both giving and receiving, taking and offering, in patterns that connected generations across time and cultural boundaries. "Your mother was a saint," the woman said simply, her words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "My grandmother told me stories about the white woman who married the Apache chief and brought peace to the desert, but I never believed such things were possible until today. When I could not afford medicine for my son, I brought him to her statue because people say she still watches over sick children." Taza smiled as he accepted the wooden scorpion, recognizing it as both a symbol of the danger that had first brought his family together, and a reminder that healing often emerged from the most unlikely and threatening circumstances. Emma's story had indeed taken on mythical dimensions, but the myths were grounded in very real achievements that continued to benefit people long after her death. Looking up at the bronze face of the woman who had shaped his life in ways that went far beyond mere survival, Taza made a silent promise to continue her work of building bridges between communities that remained divided by fear and misunderstanding. The challenges facing the 20th century would be different from those Emma had encountered, but they would still require the same combination of medical knowledge, cultural sensitivity, and unwavering commitment to healing that had made her legend. As the stars emerged in the clear desert sky above New Harmony, Taza gathered his family and began the journey home, carrying with him the wooden scorpion and the renewed determination to honor Emma's memory through continued service. To all people who needed healing, regardless of their race or cultural background, the woman who had once knelt beside a dying Apache child in the dust had created a legacy that would endure as long as there were people willing to risk everything for the welfare of others. The bronze statue remained in the town square, illuminated by gaslight that would burn throughout the night, standing as a permanent reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes are those who simply refuse to walk away when others are suffering, and that love expressed through healing hands can overcome barriers that armies and politicians cannot breach. Emma Morales Kie's story would continue to inspire new generations of healers and peacemakers, for as long as people remembered that courage and compassion could change the world, one life at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.